The 2014 International Journalism Festival begins now. My name is Christopher Potter. I'm co-founder, together with Arianna Ciccone, of the festival, and my role this evening is to give a brief introduction to this opening event. I'm doing so in English for the benefit of those who are following us in live streaming on the festival website and also on the site of La Repubblica. The first thing I'd like to do is welcome you all to this special event. I'm sure you'll find the discussion this evening very stimulating. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend, obviously, an invitation to come to the full festival, which takes place in Perugia from this Wednesday until Sunday, as has been the case for the past 7 years. So this is a special anteprima, and from Wednesday until Sunday in Perugia, the festival takes place in its entirety. The festival this year is special for 3 reasons. First, the past. It's been a roller coaster ride over the past year or so. Those who have followed the festival closely will know why. In particular, it's worth mentioning the crowdfunding campaign which allowed us to get to this point. We almost didn't make it, but we are here in part thanks to the contribution and the support of many hundreds of people, some of whom are possibly here in this room, and it's worth mentioning that fact at this moment. The second point is in relation to the festival itself, which begins today and continues Wednesday, and I would like to say that even before the festival has come to an end, that in our opinion it will be undoubtedly the best yet, for 2 principal reasons. First, the range of international speakers in particular who will take part in the festival this year is unprecedented. There are a total of over 500 speakers, a significant proportion of whom are from outside Italy and indeed outside Europe. This obviously enriches the festival program, and we're very proud of this year. The second element to mention is the range of content, over 220 different sessions in Perugia from Wednesday through to Sunday. And thirdly, a significant proportion of women in the festival program. We're proud of this accomplishment, and it's worth underlining the proportion of women speakers who we're pleased to be able to say have accepted our invitation to participate. The third novelty in some way this year is that, as we are here in Rome, this is the first time in 8 years that the festival has an event which is outside Perugia. Why? Well, 2 reasons. One is to spread our wings. We felt after 7 full years in Perugia this was the right moment to extend our ambitions and our horizons a little bit, and here we are in Rome for that reason. Second is that thanks to the support and assistance of one of our main sponsors, Enel, we are pleased to offer this particular evening's discussion in association with Enel, and for this we are very grateful. And at this point I would like to invite Gianluca Comin, who is the External Relations Director of Enel, to say a few words about this particular event. Gianluca.
Grazie, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. And now we switch to Italian, then we'll be back in English. A few months ago, Chris and Arianna met with us, and there was a bit of a problem. The municipality of Perugia wasn't clear whether it would be supporting the festival or not, and we had the idea of taking it to Rome and taking it to this wonderful facility which Enel is involved with, and then things through crowdfunding and other methods were solved, and so the festival as his right remained in Perugia, but we wanted to maintain this preview, this which I think is a special thing for Rome, and it's a major opportunity to listen to two editors. And Media and Power is the title, but I also think the media communication power is important, because where companies are also part of this triangle, it's something which is central to people who do business and who are in the corporate world and who are involved in policies. And so this is important also for the people who are following and streaming on the Enel websites. There'll be other opportunities to meet in Perugia with the meeting on journalism in Latin America. The Enel Group is very much present in South America. We're the largest energy company in Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, and Peru. And therefore, the editors of the main newspapers in these countries will be speaking of the relationship between democracy and information. For them, we'll speak of new media, and finally, women and power, with an interview with the Speaker of the lower house in Italy, Lala Boldrini. So I think this is a very good beginning. Give the floor back to Chris.
Thanks, Gianluca. The event this evening is entitled, or the subtitle is, The Clash Between Media and Power. It's worth mentioning that since the Snowden scoop, the Guardian has been at the forefront of investigations in this area. There's a lot which will be said about this, including the mention of the Pulitzer Prize, which no doubt you're well aware was awarded to the Guardian just a couple of weeks ago. In addition, the role of La Repubblica in the war between media and power in Italy over the last 10 or 20 years is something which will be analysed in this discussion between Alan Rusbridger, Ezio Mauro, with Enrico Franceschini as moderator. At this point, I leave you to enjoy the discussion. I'm sure you'll find it very stimulating, and this is the reason, as I said before, why we've called this particular event The War on Journalism.
For conventional journalism, the game is over.
This is something that's not our place to decide. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong.
The United States must renounce its witch hunt against WikiLeaks.
In fact, excluded from Russia, and this is the first time that an accredited American correspondent has been expelled from the country.
Because I am not only a journalist, I am a blogger, and not all bloggers are journalists, but every blogger could be killed for his speech.
Do you love this country? One of the things we are patriotic about is the nature of the democracy and the nature of a free press, and the fact that one can in this country discuss and report these things.
What battles must we still fight in order to survive?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Enrico Franceschini, Ezio Mauro, and Alan Rusbridger.
Buonasera. Allora, buonasera a tutti.
Good evening all. And the light's really intense. I find it very difficult to see anybody. But my name is Enrico Franceschini. I'm the correspondent of Repubblica from London. Alan, can you hear the translation? Good. It's a pleasure to be here with my editor, Ezio Mauro, and Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, who I had the pleasure of meeting in London. So here to talk about the war on journalism, the relationship between media and power, and other things, if we want, because we have two special guests who know a lot of things about journalism. I'll be making a brief introduction, and we'll start with the questions, and then if we have time, it would be nice to have some questions from the audience too. Repubblica and The Guardian are two newspapers which are very similar. They have a lot of things in common. They're both progressive and liberal, centre-left newspapers. They're both relatively young newspapers, and also newspapers that represent a way of understanding journalism, but also a cultural brand in a way, an identity. And curiously, in Britain, as in Italy, the readers of these two newspapers identify with lots of things in the newspapers, the books which are reviewed, the films, the people who write on the newspaper, and the way of looking at the world and perceiving the world. They're also similar graphically. They're similar in many things, in their formats. And they're also similar in their two editors, because Alan and Ezio have, strangely enough, a very similar career. They both started as reporters. They both had an experience as foreign correspondents, Ezio from Moscow and Alan from Washington. And they've been editors basically for the same period of time, about 20 years. Alan since 1995 and Ezio since 1996 of Repubblica and The Guardian. And both of them have launched sections which have revolutionized journalism, G2 in The Guardian and R2 in Repubblica. So many things in common, but probably the thing which they have most in common is that they're two newspapers which have battled for press freedom against power structures who are trying to keep them quiet and weren't pleased to hear them speak out. Guardian's battle, which led it to win the Pulitzer Prize, was the most recent one was Datagate and the revelations on Edward Snowden, on the mass tapping and interceptions of the NSA, and then there was also the WikiLeaks with Julian Assange. Repubblica, I shouldn't say this because it's my newspaper too, but I'm a correspondent who is far away, and I feel that I can be impartial in observing. The newspaper is the newspaper which in Italy has done most to cover the private vices and the public flaws of the Berlusconi government, and Silvio Berlusconi in particular, and with the 10 questions which were published continuously and repeatedly on our pages, challenged Berlusconi to answer those questions. And so these are two newspapers who found themselves alone in this battle, and this is something which we'll be discussing this evening. Alone, because both in London and in Rome there were people who told them that what they were doing was not the right thing to do, was not really connected with press freedom, and was more of an ideological battle. And I would like to start from this, and I'd like to ask each of you, in the early 21st century, what is the role of a newspaper, of a major newspaper in a democracy? Alan, would you like to start?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to hear, and I've admired Repubblica from afar, and Ezio and I have felt like brothers sometimes in our struggles. I think the context for what we're doing is changing all the time. So how we do our job, the context of technology, the context of what other people are doing, and how we can harness that. All that is changing all the time. It's changing very fast, and it's important to be able to understand what traditional journalism is and how that bears in relation to what everybody else is doing. But at its core, I don't think what we're doing is changing. I think the business of reporting accurately what is going on around us, of being independent from all forms of power, commercial, political, legal, and holding power to account. I think these are things that journalism has always done. There will always be a need for it. There will always be a need for professional journalists and for professional journalism. So that much hasn't changed, but almost everything else is changing.
Ezio.
Ezio, what should a newspaper do in the 21st century? Well, let's say that in the past, newspapers told their readers, I'm saying up to the 60s probably, told them about segments of the world which readers had not experienced and which they probably would never experience directly. Today, the internet just changed everything. Everything's out on the web. At the same time, geography has changed because everything is ubiquitous and we can reach everything from everywhere. And also, habits have changed. There's been a change in the knowledge basis. Children know more about technology than we do. There are things on the internet which have much higher value than long-standing companies which were established a century ago. But the function of journalism is still important because whereas on the internet what counts is, it's like in a river, the flow rate and the speed of the river, but between a essay by Habermas and something which is just improvised by a blogger, there'll always be a huge this is indistinguished on the internet. But what the newspapers do is to have 1 foot in the flow, in the river, and 1 foot outside, to let all these news flow and to capture some of them. And with these pieces they capture, try to reconstruct the reality so that people who read the newspaper the next day can understand the things as they hang together. And that's why newspapers collect and hold and grasp those pieces of news which have significance, have meaning. And we can ask ourselves why Assange and Snowden contacted newspapers. They didn't just empty everything they had onto the internet. It's because the newspapers worked on the documents and they did what journalism is supposed to do. The Guardian, the Washington Post and Spiegel, they established priorities and the importance of that message, and they brought out the meaning in that material. There's another function too, which is probably why we're here this evening, which is to investigate that very special area of democratic societies where the contradictions of power emerge, where there are patent contradictions in power. That's a good place for journalists to work. So starting from what Ezio just said, let's come to the core of our discussion. The Guardian, together with the Washington Post, just won the Pulitzer Prize for the Snowden case. Your newspaper, Alan, was also accused of having assisted terrorism with these revelations, and for having damaged your own country, for not being patriotic, and for working against the Secret Service. You've been called to testify before Congress almost as an accomplice in a crime. So I'll ask you, and I'll be asking Ezio later with regard to what Repubblica did. Why was it legitimate to publish these things? How did you defend yourself? How do you defend yourself? And I'm sure you're obviously proud of having won this prize, but you also experienced some very difficult passages. Is that true?
Well, the thing that pleased me about the Pulitzer Prize was that it was for public service. And I think it was beyond journalism. It was the judges of the Pulitzer Prize saying that a public service had been performed by putting this information into the public domain. And I think the public service was more or less as Edward Snowden set it out in the first place. So what he said was that as an engineer, as somebody who was familiar with the technology of the internet. Something had happened since the beginning of this century that was invisible to most people, and I think still is invisible to most people. And he felt, and we agreed, that the extent of intrusion that was now possible and was taking place was something that needed debate and consent. And I think actually everybody agrees with that now, even from Obama and the heads of the security services downwards. They realized that you couldn't do this without debate. But I think it goes much further than that. I think that what has been revealed touches on the role of private companies, both the internet companies that we trust with all our information, with telecom companies, with the people who build the infrastructure and who encode it on the web. It goes to the question of the degree of consent that we as citizens have in the degree to which the state can collect, analyze and store information on us. That goes to the extent to which parliaments and congresses are capable of meaningful oversight of what's going on and what stops technologies being used malignly. And that goes to the questions of the laws that have been constructed, because most of the laws in most countries were not created for the digital age. So what Edward Snowden revealed was a huge thing, which is going to be one of the big themes of the 21st century. And it was sometimes a menacing thing to have to investigate this and set it out, but it was extremely rewarding that at the end this was acknowledged as an act of public service by the Pulitzer Board.
Scusa se faccio un piccolo follow-up.
I apologize if I follow up on that question. When you were accused of assisting terrorism, what did you think? What did you reply when you went to Parliament?
Well, the question was, which took me by surprise, do you love your country? Can you be a journalist and write this sort of thing and still be a patriot? And that surprise, it hadn't occurred to me I was going to be asked that question. And my answer, I think you saw a clip of it just then, was what I love about Britain is that it is a country that has nurtured, some people believe created, the idea of free speech and a free press. And that is what makes me proud of Britain. And it was distressing to me that this was a story that couldn't be reported out of Britain. But that is, obviously as a journalist, one is aware of the countervailing balances. It wasn't that we sailed into this story blindly, disregarding security. We appreciated the balances that had to be made, but nevertheless, as I think most objective people now recognize, there was at the core of this story not just one, but multiple public interests that were served by being taken out and revealed and discussed factually so that a debate can take place. And that comes back to the original question of what is journalism for? Journalism is to provide the facts so that a debate can take place. Otherwise, we're all going to live in the dark and all debates are meaningless.
Ecco.
So I think another analogy is this one. We wrote that the Pulitzer Prize rehabilitated the Guardian from the accusations which were leveled against it, because America congratulated it with the Pulitzer Prize for public service. So and also it received a lot of solidarity during the storm of revelations from other newspapers, including ours. This is very similar to what happened to Repubblica, which for many years felt isolated. It was accused in Italy, put in the dock, and people said you tell things which aren't important or which shouldn't be divulged, which are referred to some people's personal private lives, and you received solidarity too from some foreign newspapers and weeklies, from the Neiman Foundation, which is the prestigious American Department of Journalism, which gave you a prize for the 10 questions which you asked Berlusconi. So perhaps you could tell us how you felt, how the mood was in the paper at that time, and why you decided, no, we've got to tell these things. These are not just private matters. It's more than that. Well, there was nothing private, which was quite obvious, because this is something which broke out with an interview from Berlusconi's wife, who said that there was something really murky in what Berlusconi was doing, that he was providing candidatures to young girls in exchange for sexual favors. And so it's when his wife said he was ill and that he was dealing with underage girls. And this is quite enough in any country with the free press to cover this issue and try to find some clarity in these contradictions. And that's what we tried to do. In the very cumbersome defense which the Prime Minister put together on the Prima Porta TV program, in a program where there weren't many questions asked of him, but a lot of justifications which he expressed, we identified some things which we felt to be lies and incongruities, and we said, we've got 10 questions to the Prime Minister on things which we find to be obscure. Obviously, he can clarify this by answering these questions. And we were told the Prime Minister Berlusconi is in Egypt talking to Mubarak, and I'll talk to him when he comes back. It was Friday, and I said, okay, we'll wait till Tuesday. We didn't get any response on Tuesday, and we published those questions. Those questions were published, printed every day for 6 months, because no answers were given, and also because it was important to understand the contradictions, the incongruities, and the problems which this gave rise to. For example, whether the Prime Minister could be blackmailed because of what he'd done. These were things of general interest. Barbara Berlusconi, Berlusconi's daughter, said all political leaders have to account for his private behavior in public, and I say particularly when this embarrasses the institutions. And these questions continue to be printed, even though the Prime Minister, in a press conference with the Spanish Prime Minister, called the journalist from Repubblica a criminal, and even though he invited young entrepreneurs not to advertise on Repubblica, even though he advised entrepreneurs in general to boycott the press, and said, then specified he was referring to Repubblica, and not being able to answer the questions which were then repeated and by more than 100 papers in the world. He was then, a case was brought against the paper in the courts, and saying that these weren't questions but were libel. And the court decided that these were legitimate questions and that needed to be answered. He answered later in the most protective way for himself, avoiding any debate, just going to his favorite TV journalist, Bruno Vespa, who didn't ask him any embarrassing questions, but he had to answer. And with the method which he used to answer, he showed that there was a limit, that he couldn't face an open discussion. And so journalism went on with obstinacy, and some people said, how's this going to all end up? And I said, I don't know how this is going to end up. When he answers, we'll see what happens, and we'll have to respond. We too would said, as happened to Alan, we said that we were anti-patriotic, we're anti-Italians, and we wrote an article saying that democracy needs everybody to do their job, first of all. And secondly, democracy means that people who have legitimately acquired the support of the Italians should be able to explain their policies and their actions. They're allowed to do this, but they should do this within the rules. And there have to be counterbalances to power, including the power of the press. The counterbalance of the press. Alan previously was saying, I'm proud to be British because Britain, one of the things I like most about Britain is that it nurtured freedom of speech. Now, you have also spoken of an idea of Italy which you see as a republic. If someone to ask you, why do you love Italy? If someone would say you're an anti-Italian, what would you answer? I would say I love Italy because of my passion for democracy, and therefore I fully respect legitimate power, but also respect the rules within which power has to move. And I think that our task is to work on that boundary, specifically. And I don't think that an accusation of anti-Italianness is an accusation of lèse-majesté, and it was done by a power who doesn't accept any counterbalances because it feels that it is unlimited and that there is no there are no constitutional breaks on what it can do, or no breaks on the part of the press. I'd like to ask you both, Alan, do you think that the battle between journalism and power, power which tries to shut newspapers up, do you think that this has become more difficult than in the past? If we compare it, say, for example, to the age of Watergate, is it easier or more difficult to tell the truth in a newspaper today?
Well, I mean, there are countries where it's murderous to be a journalist, so we must get this all into proportion. I mean, there are people where to be a journalist is to risk being killed, and there are many journalists being killed every week of the year around the world. But I think we would hope, as citizens of democracies, that our countries were better than that. And that we believed in the high ideals of free speech and free expression. And so I'm concerned when I see the best places in the world turning against journalism and behaving in a way that I think sets a terrible example. So, you know, I think it was a bad thing for Britain that the Prime Minister ordered the Cabinet Secretary in to the Guardian and that we had to smash up our computers and be unable to report this story from Britain so that it had to go to America to be reported. I think that damaged the notion of Britain as a cradle of free speech and sent a bad signal to countries about what this idea of a free press could be. And conversely, in America, we found sanctuary in the First Amendment, which is, you know, probably the highest standard of free speech. But when you go to America and you make that speech and say, "Thank you, America, for letting us report from New York," American journalists are a bit jaded about this because the treatment of whistleblowers in America has not been great. There have been more whistleblowers prosecuted under Obama than in the whole of the Republic beforehand. So America is behaving very punitively towards people who give information in the public good, in the public service. But before we get terribly gloomy about it, I think the technologies that enable everyone to spy on everyone, these fantastically intrusive technologies, also enable us as journalists to find the best sanctuary for our reporting. And I was struck. So, you know, we found sanctuary for our reporting in the First Amendment, as we did with WikiLeaks. And I think that is a very hopeful thing, that these places where it is terrible being a journalist and where there is no free speech and where journalists are regularly threatened and murdered and really intimidated for what they're trying to do, that the digital technologies will enable us to tell these stories from outside. And I think this comes back to your question about patriotism and,
Yes.
And the question of being an insider, because these things look very different from depending on where you're being reported from. So I think it was relatively easy for Americans to report on GCHQ. They didn't feel any conflict there, and maybe we found it easier to report on the NSA. And if an Edward Snowden appeared in Russia or in Iran, we would think that was a good thing. Or in China, or from within the Pakistan ISI, we would race to embrace these whistleblowers and say that this was a good thing. So I think there's something about what's happening technologically, which is changing these notions of narrow notions of patriotism. It is simultaneously allowing a frightening degree of control and a threat to journalism. But I think as journalists and as citizens, we ought to be smart enough to think how we can turn it to our advantage.
Ezio, in Italia abbiamo avuto la strategia.
In Italy, we had what was called the strategy of tension for many years, and state secrets which were never revealed. You were a news reporter, now you're an editor. Do you think it's more difficult or easier to try and discover what the state tries to hide from people? Well, let's say that power structures has a capability, has cultural hegemony, which it had less in the past. Society's more complex, but there's more cultural hegemony, and this is especially done through trivializing things. The response of the power structures to what the Guardian and other media did was to say this is something everybody knew. There's nothing new about this. We know that spy and intelligence services do surveillance. We didn't know 38 embassies were being surveilled. We didn't know that the G20 summit in London had been infiltrated. Internet cafes had been set up in order to collect internet communication in real time and transmit this to analysts. We didn't know that heads of government, heads of state were tapped, and we didn't know that millions of citizens were under surveillance. We didn't know that the British secret services were planning to transform all mobile phones into spy devices. We didn't know that, according to Handelsblatt, 350 hotels in the world were monitored in their reservations so that action could be taken in order to tap certain rooms. We didn't know that underwater cables were infiltrated so that information could be taken from it directly. We didn't know, as Alan said, that 9 giant companies in the Silicon Valley had reached agreements to provide information, and we didn't know that this data was used in order to form predictive profiles of users, and this was combined with geolocation data, identifying social profiles, religious profiles, political profiles, sexual profiles of candidates with their preferences. And so the task of journalism increasingly in the dispersed news items, universal dispersed news items, is not just to collect news, it's to give a name to the news you publish, which means taking the responsibility of providing news and giving weight to news and defining them for what they are, telling readers this is what this is about. When you name what is happening and what you're telling on the covering on the newspaper, you combat the trivialization carried out by governments and power structures. And this, and if you say that something is distorting the balance between power and between democracy and security, and tilting it towards security, you have to take your responsibility. If you say that the laws which are done out of laws are being done out of self-interest, this means that legislative power is using the power in order to block the judiciary. You defining something, and in doing this, you're taking the responsibility of taking a position. You can't just float in the river. You can't just be ambiguous. You can't just allow that power to wait for it to become weak and then turn on it. Alan, I wanted to ask you a question, and I'll ask Ezio the same question. The digital revolution, is it something which helps newspapers and the media to find out things which the governments want to keep hidden? We've seen this in China, and we've seen this in the Arab Spring, when Twitter managed to bypass the censorship on state media. But sometimes the internet also generates problems. We don't know whether what comes from the internet is credible. We have to assess the items on the internet. So is it a role of newspapers to help people to distinguish between all the items and things which come out on the internet, and distinguish between what's useful and which can be misleading, because the internet can also be used in order to manipulate people and mislead people, as sometimes happens. What do you think of this?
This goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we have to rethink the role of journalists in the context in which we all exist. So Glenn Greenwald is a blogger. He doesn't look like a conventional journalist. He was a lawyer. He wrote obsessively about one subject and in great depth and with great expertise. Now, it was because The Guardian we've more or less defined ourselves by being an open newspaper, which means we try to be completely open to this new ecostructure of information and try and work out what is the most valuable and how we can best harness it to give a better account of the world. And we hired Glenn Greenwald because we thought he was a really interesting voice, even though he wasn't a conventional journalist. And what is certain is that the New York Times, I can't think of an American paper that would have hired Glenn Greenwald, because American journalism is very hung up on notions of objectivity and so on and so forth, and Glenn is not objective. But because we hired Glenn, Snowden goes to Glenn because he recognizes somebody who writes with expertise about this subject, but he also wants The Guardian because he wants the standards of journalistic editing, and he wants, frankly, the Guardian's audience, 100 million people around the world every month. And so that was a way in which the old world is intersecting with the new world. Now, I think as journalists, maybe humility is not our strong suit. But I think it's important. I think it's important to say that there was, for 200 or 300 years, a period in which we had complete power. We had the only means we had the printing presses. You didn't. Now you've all got printing presses. You've all got your individual printing presses, and out of, I don't know how many people are here tonight, but out of the hundreds of people that are here tonight, you're all publishers. Some of you got interesting things to say, some of you haven't. Some of you may be reliable, some of you won't be. But it's certain that some mass of what you could produce tonight would add in a valuable way to our knowledge, and you do. I'm sure all of you who blog and tweet and use Facebook are doing valuable things. Now, it is one of the jobs of journalism, I think, in the modern world, to try and work out what is valuable. Who are the interesting people in this audience tonight who if we could find ways of using you and harnessing you about whatever subject, would enable The Guardian to do a better job. and that seems to me an essential part of the future that is best done by being completely open to what you do and to blur the distinction between us on the platform and you down below, which is what it was for centuries. But at the same time, to come back to where we started, to me, the longer I do this job, the more I think there's something just wonderful about reporters. One of our reporters wrote a book recently about bees and how bees are under threat. And when bees are threatened, that's the whole world is threatened. And I feel the same about reporters. Reporters are like bees. You need reporters, you need bees, and you need reporters to go out and find the stuff that, you know, with all due respect to this audience, you're not going to find out. And the Snowden story didn't happen by accident. It came to Greenwald through the process that I described, but it also took a team of 25 journalists to sit down and wade through those documents laboriously, discover what they meant, to produce them safely. And that was an enormous task that also required the institutional weight of a newspaper behind it, because we came under severe attack. And there's no doubt that, to my mind, that if that had been an individual blogger or reporter on their own, that story would have been snuffed out. So you need robust news organizations that can stand behind reporting, stand behind the bees, and defend the journalism. So I think that's what's so interesting about journalism at the moment, is that one can't tell how this balance is going to settle down. But it's clear to me that we need both bits of it.
Ezio, allora, c'è ancora...
Ezio, do we still need journalists, or can the internet cope on its own? This is probably a self-interested question. So do we need journalists, or can the web produce everything? If a blogger had come up with the 10 questions, if there hadn't been Giuseppe D'Avanzo, there wouldn't have been the 10 questions. This obstinate passion to find out the truth about these things, and this brave under-assessment of the ratio of power, because it was completely one-sided, and wanting to uphold Western values. He was accused of being obsessed, of exaggerating, of being ideological. And when the Guardian and Le Monde, Libération, El País spoke up, we realized that we were just upholding a Western tradition, a Western value, which it's very unfortunate to have to say this, was not respected in Italy. Once a Dutch journalist who was putting things away after a TV interviewer said, why are the attacks against the Repubblica obviously for Europeans attacks against freedom of the press, whereas for Italian journalists they're not? It's and it's the Repubblica which is attacking people. It's the table's completely turned. We need journalists. We're living in a situation where power is very exposed, much more than in the past. Let's take the latest demonstration there was in Rome. Remember the pictures of the demonstrator with a broken bottle, which was something which was photographed by other people on the street and which ended up on the newspapers, and that foot of the policeman treading on a demonstrator. The chief police had to step in because that was an idiot. A boy protecting a girl's body and the policeman's foot treading on her. This is a spontaneous witness provided by the people who are out on the streets, who feel they want to make this public, and who look for the sounding board of the media and the newspapers, who not only show those news items but try to establish the priority among news items, trying to find out who are responsible for those things, open up all the pieces which lead to that incident so that people have an overall picture when they read the article. This is what journalism is, establishing a context. Not everything flows in the river. Journalism is something which finds a link, and in that link this opens up a landscape, a territory. Do you want to understand this, or just want to pass by like a train saying, I saw that, I glanced at that? And journalism gives you this more complete picture. The fact that Bernardo Valli did the covered the trial against Mubarak, and it was probably the 30th time he'd been to Egypt, has meaning, has because he's been to all the capitals of the Arab Spring more than once, and this is a value which is essential. This has to be combined with the technological driver of the internet, which provides us with great capabilities. But Alan was reminding us of other aspects in the internet, so you have to be careful. The explosion of surveillance is to a large extent due to the fact that when you start trying to check things, you have to check everything. And the NSA had thought of doing surveillance on video games, because said video games display attitudes to command, drives to recruit people, and they thought they wanted to infiltrate video games, because when you start controlling things, you want to control everything. What this means is that we used to say that we thought the most cynical statement there was that the end justified the means. But here, the means tend to decide what the ends are. Bauman says the axe takes control over the executioner's hand. It's the axe which decides. The executioner can stand back. It's the rope which decides who is going to be hanged and when. So the means becomes independent. Technology has its own value and power which we can't control. So they did these things, but the simple reason that they could, the New York Times wrote. This was the same justification which Clinton gave of his behavior in the Levinsky trial. He did it because he could, and its power feels it now, sees it has comes up against limits. Karl Rove told a journalist in the Washington Post, "We invent reality because we can do it." And while you try to decode and cover the reality which we're inventing another reality, and you can't do anything about it. This is the maximum gap between security and rights. But the Atlantic said in this, and if you read Fabio Cusi's book, it gives us the whole of the case. The Atlantic at some point raised the question, are we sure that these exceptional security measures which we take for safety reasons won't be used one day for the purposes of dominion? And in the West, in a democracy, can we use the same means which Putin uses? What will happen to us if we go down this road and don't set ourselves any limit? So there's a maximum spread between power and politics. Power is the possibility of doing things. Politics is the possibility of deciding which things should be done, which are the right things to be done, and which are the things which are best for the country. Right, so I will now ask one more question to our two guests, and then I'll say I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience, if there are any. So think about them, get ready, but if you do have questions, make sure that they are brief. We have a British guest, so let's have British-style questions and not have public statements. So I'll have one question. I'll be keeping one for the end, so I'm trying to take advantage of my position here. It's one question which doesn't, it's not so much the relationship between media and power, but the power of the internet. Repubblica and the Guardian have another similarity, two free open sites which don't have a paywall. They decided that they're the most followed websites of this type in their countries. Is there a future in this? What's the future for newspapers with these websites? Why is it you decided not to have paywalls?
Well, it was part. I mean, we've never come out and said we will never do it. We're not complete fundamentalists. So partly it's a journalistic question. I mean, actually, I don't know of a journalist who, in journalistic terms, wants a paywall. I don't believe there is one. There may be journalists who believe that this is going to lead to economic salvation. But I don't know of journalists who don't want their work to be out there and shared and distributed and discussed and to be bouncing around the world and to be causing influence and debate and provocation. That's why we go into journalism. So the notion that you want your journalism not to be read and to be unlinkable to and untweetable, I don't know who these journalists are. So journalistically, it seems to me obvious that being open is better. The next question is about the behavior of people. So if it is a pure journalistic proposition, pure digital proposition, as opposed to a bundled print and digital proposition, is there enough evidence that the money that's going to come through digital subscriptions is going to be enough? I think that's an open question. So it seems to me these are open questions, and it's healthy for newspapers to be trying different things. So I think it's healthy for the Guardian to be completely open, just as it is for other people to be trying something that's very closed. In terms of the Guardian, we sat down about 3 years ago. We set out a business plan year by year by year, and all I can say is we're beating it. So we'll be publishing our financial results in about a month's time, and they'll be good. They'll be much better than last year, much better than the year before, and better than we thought they would be. So the commercial managers at the Guardian are not begging me to have a paywall. They believe actually they don't want a paywall because they believe that we are on a route to sustainability without one.
Ezio, Repubblica.
So what about Repubblica? Well, nothing will change in terms of Repubblica.it is. We have 2.5 single users, and we'll continue to give real-time news with the page changing every day while we're making the printed newspaper every day. And when Repubblica Sera, which comes out at 7 p.m., which is a native digital newspaper which is targeted to the iPad, so it comes out every evening for the iPad. While these newspapers take shape throughout the day, on the web we have a ribbon of continuous ribbon of news coming out on the website. Nothing will change there, but at the same time there are almost 80,000 people who buy apps to read Repubblica, which we call Repubblica Plus, and people buy this so that they can read it on their iPads, on their mobiles. We know that mobiles will be getting bigger screens in the short and medium term, because by now they're used as tools to exchange news and videos. So we're thinking of leaving Repubblica.it as it is, free, and add something else, provide a premium pay service. People who are subscribed to Repubblica Plus and who buy Repubblica's electronic publications, and people who want to subscribe to these extra services. So there'll be something extra. It won't take anything away from Repubblica.it, but will provide specially targeted content to people who want more. So you've said something similar, 2 models, I think, there. All right, so a couple of questions. There's a gentleman here in the front row, if you can get the microphone to him.
Buonasera.
Good evening. My question is connected with the topic of this meeting, war on journalism, the relationship between media and power, which is a crucial issue, particularly in Italy, because I live in Italy, in that if this evening were to be were to focus on Italy specifically, I would call it the war on journalism by journalism. And so I'd like to ask the two editors to say something about the responsibility which the Italian press has had in not allowing our democracy to mature in the same way as British democracy, and the contiguous role which our press, the culture of our press, continues to have with power, and this lack of distance. There's a major difference with British and American newspapers with regard to power. There's much more interaction and contact in Italy. I don't think the Guardian would ever, as Repubblica does, I don't think the Guardian would ever have 10 pages on politics and on rumors about politics and interviews on politics, as other Italian newspapers, Corriere della Sera and Messaggero, do, whereas there's another type of newspaper like Il Giornale, run by Berlusconi, which has a very partisan approach. So Italian democracy has some very aberrant positions, and our media have no rivals in the world in terms of their connection and interaction with power structures. I think that we, Italian media and the Italian press, has to exercise some self-criticism about the fact that we, despite all the reports and all the coverage and all the investigative journalism, there's still a unhealthy relationship with power. I think that the reader is the least important target for the Italian press. Politicians, then the journalists come next, and then the major owners of the economy, and last of all come the readers. I'd like to ask for your reaction on that.
Non proprio una domanda.
Well, it wasn't really a brief, concise question as I'd asked, but I think there was a clear point made. Let's have a second question. That lady. So, one man, one woman. I hope that it will also be something which refers to Britain, not just Italy. Yes, my question is directed to the editor of the Mr. Rusbridger. I read your I read the Guardian online every day, and I find it fantastic. She's been asked to speak a bit closer to the microphone. I really like your the fact that you have free comments, and there are people who every day carry young Chomsky, people who are commenting every day, and I find all these comments to be of a very high level. So first of all, I'd like to thank you, and secondly, I'd like to put a question to you and also to La Repubblica. Recently, a newspaper, and I'm not going to mention any names, accepted a gag order. So in another country, the government said, don't publish these things. So since I prefer can we get to the question? Otherwise, you'll be even longer than the Italian. So my question is to both of them, but perhaps more to Mr. Rusbridger, is whether he would accept a gag order from another country. Okay, so that's enough for now. Would you like to respond to that, Alan?
I'm trying to think if there's any circumstance in which that could happen.
I mean, it was certainly true during Snowden and during WikiLeaks when we had a dialogue in advance of publication with the White House and the NSA and the American agencies. And that was a mature dialogue which I think worked for both, and I'm glad that we did it. But at no point was there ever a gag order or an order or a threat to use any American law against us. I mean, it would have been interesting if they had tried that against an international paper in the same way that the British state had tried it against the Guardian. So, I mean, my instinct is to say, no, I wouldn't accept a gag order from another country, but it's very easy to say that on stage. And I'm sure if our New York lawyers were watching, they could think of circumstances in which it would be impossible to resist if you were reporting from America.
Ezio, come rispondi a questa critica al giornalismo italiano?
Ezio, what would you say? I would say that journalism is something which is done on a daily basis. There are some days we're happier with the product, and other days we're less happy with what we come out with. We know that when we leave buildings, not later than now, my colleagues are still doing the headlines of the front page. We know whether the newspaper has some exclusive coverage, anything new, whether some of the things which we were planning a few days ago have managed to reach their target or not, and whether the things we were looking for have escaped us or not. The day after, when we look at the newspaper and we see that there are mistakes, we try to track back to the branch where we took the wrong road to understand whether that path was the wrong way, or whether it might turn out to be a shortcut which we took out of laziness. Journalism is something which is very tiring, because even the best thing you do is finish the next day. It's over, because you need to repeat your efforts every day, and if there weren't a method in this, it would be impossible to grasp all the content of the day and put it into a newspaper. But among the reasons for concern there might be in doing this job, where you're also judged by yourself, by your colleagues in the newsroom, by public opinion and the readers, which are what counts most. Among the reasons of concern, there's certainly not contiguity with power. When I was I left Italy and became a correspondent from Moscow, because I thought that after 8 years in Italy, my relations with politicians had probably gone beyond the boundaries I needed to set myself. I've always set myself the rule of not going to lunch with politicians. I believe that in a democratic society, politics has to be at the head of the table, has to have the pack in hand, and has to deal the cards, because politics can only regulate the interaction between the legitimate interests which exist in society. But I had set myself a rule never to go out to lunch or dinner with a politician, and to establish a distinctive mark between me and them, to have a notebook and a pen. The journalist lives in the midst of powerful people in politics and the economy, because we've been focusing on politics and not mentioned managers and executives, because it's not just politicians who are responsible for the backwardness in our country, it's also our corporate executives. We're here to say the things they don't want to say. We're here on behalf of readers. We're not protagonists, we're witnesses. Often we're privileged observers, and we can do that when in the right place at the right time, and with a system of coordinates. We need to be there's a right place and the right time for the small facts and big news too. And if you're aware of your role, which is distinct, we are another race, another breed. We have different tasks, different duties. We have a different mission. You wouldn't be able to sleep at night if you did something which intermingled with power. I would like you, if you were to spend a day at the Repubblica's newsroom, you would be very surprised to see that we don't speak with politicians. I'm surprised too, because I think that there are indications we could get, saying like, tomorrow we've got a very important event. I'd like to point this out to you. These things don't happen. I don't talk with politicians much, and as the years go by, less and less. Not because I want to keep away from them, but because these are the right habits. Having a healthy distance is something which is natural. We were talking about this with Alan before. In the new format of Repubblica, we've abolished political comment, which is something which there's been in Italy since 1945 till now. It was a mechanism which was invented for a country with 18 parties, where in an article the comments which didn't produce any facts were listed in order of the weight of the parties, and this was something which flooded over into other sections in the newspaper. We've done away with this in a new version of Repubblica. This coverage is condensed in 15 lines, and politics is only covered if it turns into something factual. The pages which we devote to politics, and here there's something which editors should never do, which is to change the weighting system in a day. For 11 months, when there was a Monti government, we never got politics in the first 10 or 12 pages in the newspaper. There were graphs with the spread of interest rates and all these special reports on what Europe was asking us to do. There wasn't any politics on those pages, and so these what's important is public opinion. It's really true. The public opinion is important. Some people say it isn't, but it really is true. I don't know if Arianna is here. Arianna is aware that the battle against the law to silence people, kids who to protest against this law, put post-its on their mouths, on their eyes, and on their ears against the law to keep certain news from surfacing. This is something which started with 3 university students in Perugia who started with this post-it reaction, and we covered that, but it wasn't something which Repubblica started. It's something which is recognized by Repubblica, and so people used the newspaper as a vehicle because people recognize themselves in the newspaper, not because of its politics, but because of the way it looks at the country. A certain idea of Italy, to quote Gobetti. There's space for politics in this, but there's a much broader relationship with our readers in all this.
Allora, siccome abbiamo fatto un po' tardi...
So, since it's now a bit late, I'd like to end with one very blunt question. When I started this job, there was one reason which led me to be a journalist. I'd like to ask Alan and Ezio why they became journalists. What was the reason which made them become journalists, and if there's still something romantic in the job of journalism, an era where we speak of a digital revolution, technology, and the internet. But is there still something romantic in the job of being a journalist? Alan?
Tu perché hai iniziato?
Did you start?
Well, the Guardian over the last 3 years, we've written 2 or 3 stories that could end up as Hollywood films. You know, I would think that Snowden is going to be a film at some point. The Assange thing was going to be a film. The story of phone hacking, I imagine, is going to find some expression in cinema or television. The story we did over the last 2 years of the undercover cops, extraordinary story of police who were infiltrating protesters and having babies with women in order to establish their identities. An amazing story which somebody's going to make a film of. And so all these things that were, you know, so I think if your idea of journalism was stuck at some point in the 1970s around Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford as a kind of romantic vision of what journalism is, I still think it's as romantic as ever. You know, we still are telling extraordinary stories. Those stories are coming about as the result of extraordinary journalists doing extraordinary things. They may not be as handsome as Robert Redford, but in fact they're generally not. In the Fifth Estate they all had stubbly beards and drank too much and wore beaten up old leather jackets, which is pretty much the case. But I still think that the romance of the journalist, the seeker after truth, the outsider, the fearless battler for whatever, I still think that's a very powerful idea, and it's still real. I mean, there is, of course, another story to journalism today, which is like battery farming of my colleague Nick Davis. I'm not sure how this will translate into Italian. Calls it churnalism, the business of churning out journalism of people who never leave the office, who never have time to check facts, who are just reprocessing information, and there is, you know, if we're honest, there's a lot of that going on, and that is soul-destroying work. It's not good journalism, and it's done, you know, maybe for understandable reasons. So there's a sort of deadening aspect of journalism, which is anti-heroic and not at all romantic. But I still think, you know, the reasons that I came into journalism, you know, over the last 5 years, the Guardian's been at these extraordinary stories, and every time you get one of these stories, they attract more stories, because actually what it says about your newspaper is it reminds people of what journalism is. You know, I think particularly in Britain with Leveson and phone hacking, some people have questioned the value of journalism, and there was quite a sort of anti-mainstream media feeling that happened with, and a sort of sense of renewal with digital journalism and its possibilities. And I think what these big stories do is to remind people actually why journalism matters and why people become journalism and what journalism can be.
Ezio, the romantic.
Ezio, is there still something romantic in our job? Sometimes I think I did this because I didn't want to do anything else. I always thought of producing newspapers since I was a kid. I did that when I made newspapers when I was at school, and later. That's what I always wanted to do. I still remember the way articles started were started by journalists who I liked a lot. I like a bit less now, and I think that we can still advise young people to do this job. I think it's important that you like good writing and good reading, and I think that you need to know that there's a really deep technique in journalism. It's only an Italian defamation which thinks that journalism is a relative of literature. Journalism can write things which have the same level of literature when it doesn't imitate literature, when it remains within the scope of its rules and its models. And there is a technique, and people who stay in the people in the newsrooms who never leave the newsroom and try and refine articles and improve them so that they're worth much more than they were originally. So there are lots of values in this job which can be transmitted, which never becomes a routine, because reality comes at you from all sides and challenges you. in all ways. So you can't rest in the same way that journalism can't be expressed in an algorithm, because it's always an interaction between two dimensions, the horizontal dimension of reality and the vertical dimension of the newspaper, which encounters reality and takes up the most significant portions, which have significance, which can cast light on the whole situation, and then decodes these things and plays them out in the newspaper. So there's an intellectual and technical aspect which is very important. Journalism also makes it possible for you to be part of the civil, political and cultural development of a country without being involved in politics directly. So I think there are lots of good reasons to do this job. Romantic is probably the picture of a waste tip which I have in my office, which there's old copies of newspapers which are thrown out, a whole pile of them, and that's something which a picture I have in my office, and it's just a warning that reminds me that this is what happens to what we do. But if you go downstairs, there's a woman also sitting on those pile of newspaper, and she's reading an old newspaper. So there's always something to read, because there's always something which remains and something which is worthwhile in journalism. And I think that journalism still responds to the three basic questions: what we need to know, what is worth remembering, and what still remains to be understood. And I think these are the three useful and functional questions for a democracy.
Grazie, allora.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Ezio, thank you to Alan, and thank you all for this evening.